Hey, I'm Mr. Beats. I regularly listen to both Joe Rogan's and Ben Shapiro's podcasts. So I was excited last summer to see that Shapiro had once again appeared as a guest on the Joe Rogan Experience, episode number 1512 on July 22nd, 2020. However, something really stood out to me as I listened. There were a lot of logical fallacies in this episode, like more than normal. This was disappointing to me, especially since Shapiro is known as a logical dude.
But you're a logical, intelligent guy.
So what are logical fallacies? Oh, you want me to tell you? Logical fallacies are common errors in reasoning based on bad logic.
Mr. Beat, what's logic?
Well, I'm glad you asked, Puppets. When I searched online, there were many different definitions of logic. The one I'm going to use for this video, though, is reaching a reasonable conclusion by adequately analyzing facts. For example, if someone spends too much money to a point where they can't afford basic necessities, then it is logical to conclude they should save their money to have more of it. At first glance, a logical fallacy seems to be true, but once we apply the rules of logic, it is problematic. Often we use logical fallacies and we don't even realize it. Logical fallacies hurt our ability to argue, but more importantly, they cause us to fall for crappy arguments. So back to the latest Joe Rogan Experience to feature Ben Shapiro. I'll play clips from that episode and pause it to point out the logical fallacy and then define it, maybe give some examples. I also have puppets to help out a little bit, so that's different. Okay, here the two talk about kosher food.
The original logic was that you were supposed to kill the animal in the most humane way, was the idea. Now, do I know if it's the most humane way now? I have no idea.
It's most certainly not, Ben.
Okay, well.
Because you have to slice
Take it up with the
throat.
rabbis, man. I don't know.
When Shapiro says, take it up with the rabbis, man, I don't know, that is an example of the faulty appeal to authority fallacy. That's using the opinion or position of an authority figure or institution of authority in place of an actual argument. One can be guilty of committing a faulty appeal to authority by trying to impress us or make us reluctant to challenge that authority's viewpoint. It just seems like he is making it up.
How can you say that?
Every week he keeps on changing things.
He's doing it to make sure the faithful do not become complacent.
But what is it with all the chickens?
Whoa, that is teal-level stuff. Way out of my league.
Here's another example of the faulty appeal to authority fallacy about the 1619 Project, which we will get into more later.
It's not good history. There are 4 Pulitzer Prize-winning historians who have said this is not good history.
Okay, be listening for the phrase, "this isn't my argument," coming up here soon.
The story of America is trying to fulfill the promises of the Declaration of Independence over time, make those promises available to everybody. And this isn't my argument. This is Martin Luther King Jr.'s argument when he talks in the March in Washington about fulfilling the promissory note of the Declaration of Independence. He says, we're here to cash the check, right? You issued us the check, and then you didn't let black Americans be Americans. We're here to cash the check. This is the argument Frederick Douglass, the freed slave, makes in 1852. He makes a famous speech before slavery is ended. And he says July 4th doesn't mean anything to black Americans because we're not included in the bargain. Martin Luther King said, in the name of the flag, civil rights are necessary.
Okay, enough of those. Let's move ahead a bit.
And the move from LA being a pretty safe, fairly nice city, suburban in orientation, to just overrun with horror shows is really, it was a lot faster than I thought it would be. But it's sort of you're right, it's a gradual decline and then it's just off a cliff.
Obviously, this is an exaggeration here, but I'd also argue that this is an example of the either-or fallacy, also known as the black or white fallacy, or false dichotomy fallacy. The either-or fallacy is when someone asserts that we must choose between 2 things, when in fact we have more than 2 alternatives. So here, Ben is basically saying, hey, it used to be a very nice suburban-like city, and now it is the worst city ever. You basically have 2 extremes when I think we all know that LA is somewhere in between. Okay, here's another example.
How much of that is historic redlining and how much of that is an 18-year-old kid today deciding to pick up a gun and shoot somebody?
And yet another example.
It's a shift that's happened throughout American society that went from the notion that men were acting like pigs and they should stop acting like pigs to what if everybody acted like pigs?
Here's a part of the episode where Rogan starts talking about regularly seeing the homeless in tents all over the city.
Well, you started to see tents, and you didn't see them at all for decades. And then all of a sudden I started seeing tents.
Now, don't get me wrong, there is no doubt that homelessness is a big problem in Los Angeles right now. But Rogan just is sharing what he's personally witnessed in parts of town, making it sound like the entire city is like that, when there's no evidence of that. This is called the part-to-whole fallacy, also known as the composition/division fallacy. It assumes that what's true about one part of something has to be applied to all or other parts of it. And here's another example.
And yet it immediately turned into, who can we blame? Who's to blame for all these dead people? Maybe it's Ron DeSantis, or maybe it's Cuomo. Like, who can we blame?
Sure, some in the media looked for people to blame, but definitely most did not. And now Rogan's going to tell an anecdote.
I took my family there before COVID, like 4 months before COVID or so. We were going to go to, there's a famous donut place there. So we said, just one of those goofy Sunday things, like, what do you guys want to do today? Let's go get donuts. So we went to downtown LA, like, holy literally human on the streets. Everything smelled like piss. Bums everywhere. And I'm like, okay, stay close to me. Stay over here.
Yeah, this is a pretty common one. The anecdotal fallacy, using personal experience or an isolated example instead of a valid argument. And let's face it, most of us are very biased based on our personal experiences. Here are some more examples of the anecdotal fallacy in the episode.
And then over the past 13 years, like, I live in a pretty decent suburban area, and I'm seeing like open needles on the street. Walked out of my house one day, there's just a guy lying face down in the gutter like Edgar Allan Poe. Like,
I remember one time we were filming in downtown LA. Anyway, we were filming some Fear Factor stunt, and as we got up, we could see people smoking crack. And I go, oh, look, there's people smoking crack right there. And the guests on the show, like a lot of them, they fly from all over the country, and they're like, is that real? They're really smoking crack? I'm like, that's crack. That's a homeless person smoking crack. Welcome to LA. It's right there.
I know people who died in the hospital of COVID, and their family could not visit them.
I didn't think it was ever going to get to the point where you're on like Winnetka off the 101, and there's 80 tents, and they put a porta potty there.
By the way, the following are clips from the same episode.
Anecdotal evidence is evidence of an anecdote. It is not evidence of a broad national trend.
And I know what you're saying, that these are anecdotes, and this doesn't encompass the full statistics of cops versus black men and how what is exactly is happening.
I don't like the idea that you are going to attribute to all of America a sin that is, number one, anecdotal in nature.
He's reacting to something that's anecdotal, but there's many of those anecdotes, and you see them over and over again.
And I was a bit surprised to hear this one, actually. Here is a loaded question.
What do you think caused the slide, or the expansion of the slide?
With further context, listening to the whole episode, Rogan is referring to the steep decline of Los Angeles. Now, it's a loaded question because it's not a fact that LA is in steep decline right now. Don't get me wrong. Things have gotten pretty bad in LA over the past year or two, as they have in many American cities. But if you look at LA historically, this is not as dramatic as Rogan and Shapiro are trying to make it out to be. A loaded question is a question that's asked that has an assumption built into it. Often it is two questions in one. One is hidden behind the other. It's like asking, why did you take that cookie? When you should have asked, did you take that cookie first? And so the better question for Rogan is to ask, is Los Angeles sliding right now? Or perhaps even, how bad is the slide in Los Angeles right now? Folks, here's one of the most common logical fallacies I see in media. That is the Texas sharpshooter, also known as cherry picking. Shapiro here is going to focus on specific evidence to back up his argument about why homelessness is such a big problem in LA.
And then they got a ruling from a court that you're allowed to live in your car, because for a while you weren't allowed to live in your car, and then it was you're allowed to live in your car. So now you're basically allowed to leave your stuff on the sidewalk, and the police are not allowed to move it, and you're allowed to live in your car. And then there was this sort of equity movement that said, okay, well, they can do it in business districts, but why can't they do it in like more suburban areas? Why can't they just move into nicer areas? After all, if there's misery, it should be equally spread across the city.
The Texas sharpshooter fallacy is when you cherry pick data clusters to suit an argument, or you find a pattern to fit a presumption. You basically just ignore evidence that doesn't neatly fit into your argument, and you focus on evidence that does help your argument. It's pretty convenient, actually. Homelessness is a very complex problem with lots of different causes. Shapiro confidently explains why homelessness in LA is such a problem, focusing only on certain evidence while ignoring lots of other evidence. And now here's a clip where they talk about marriage.
I'll go data-driven, which is the longer you live together with somebody before you get married, the higher your divorce rate after. So that is
higher the divorce rate after.
Really? If you live for a long time with somebody and then you get married, there is a higher percentage chance you will end up divorced.
That's interesting. I wonder why that is.
I mean, after just a quick Google search, I discovered that the jury's still out on this one. It's not an open and shut case. We just don't know. But Shapiro acts like he knows. The most common logical fallacy in this episode was the straw man fallacy, which is misrepresenting someone's argument to make it easier to attack. In this clip, you're going to hear Shapiro talk about authors like Robin DiAngelo and Ibram Kendi.
So what they say is, in order to be anti-racist, you have to want to tear down the entire system. They literally say this. I know that I'm not misidentifying the argument because I've read their books.
Yeah, he's misidentifying the argument. They never said that. At least when I was looking at the books, I couldn't find it. Oh, he keeps going with the straw man fallacy.
The basic notion that to be anti-racist, you have to tear down free markets, or you have to tear down free speech, or you have to, and what that means is, of course, that anytime there's rioting and looting, that's really just an expression of outrage at the broader American system, and so it justifies that sort of stuff.
Saying that to be anti-racist, you have to tear down free markets or tear down free speech, that is definitely misrepresenting the other side. Now here Shapiro has a rant against the 1619 Project, which personally I'm not a fan of, but he just completely misconstrues and oversimplifies what their mission is.
So the idea is that the entire history of America is a history of a system that is endemically white supremacist, and that all of the Declaration of Independence is basically a lie, that the principles of all men are created equal, that was a lie when it was written, and it's a lie now, that the idea that we have rights that pre-exist government, that's a lie. All of these things are lies. The Constitution was built in order to enshrine white supremacy, and no evolution has taken place. So they essentially make the argument that from 1619 to 2020 is a continuum. Racism has gone underground a little bit, but it's still there, and it's still implicit in all of our systems. So the 1619 Project has essays blaming literally everything on racism.
I mean, sure, all that is partially true, but I don't even know if Shapiro realizes he's doing this, but it is exaggeration. Here's another one. Shapiro does not think that systemic racism or institutional racism really is a big issue.
History has consequences is not the same thing as saying the rules today are racist. Because the rules today are not racist, actually. The rules today are quite not racist.
But most who talk about institutional racism today are talking about enforcement of the laws, not the actual laws themselves.
And so instead of just saying that standards exist and people don't live up to them, but the standards are actually not a bad thing, we just decided, you know what, we don't want to be hypocrites. We're getting rid of all standards whatsoever. Everybody shouldn't have standards, and if you believe that anybody should have standards, then you're a hypocrite.
I mean, he keeps saying we, but let's first establish even a small group that is saying we should get rid of all standards.
And they shut down the entire county so that douchebags could run around shattering windows, pretending that they were standing up for social justice.
No, that's not why they shut them down.
They shut down Rodeo Drive at 1 p.m. so that people could run up and down Rodeo Drive talking about how capitalism sucks while tweeting from their iPhone.
While stealing Nikes.
Oh, that's a 2-for-1. Not only was that the straw man fallacy, but that was also a tu quo que fallacy. The tu quo que fallacy is dismissing someone's viewpoint on an issue because he himself is inconsistent in that very thing. Basically, hey, this person's a hypocrite, so why should I listen to what they're saying? Shapiro and Rogan here are basically downplaying criticisms of capitalism because the critics themselves benefit from capitalism.
Are you tired of having to come up with well-thought-out arguments to defend yourself?
You betcha!
Then you should try the Tu Quoque app. It removes all of the effort by refocusing the criticism back at the person that's giving you guff.
How does it work?
The app auto-generates insults and other shortcomings to take the heat off of you.
That seems kind of asinine.
Of course you would say that, because you're a jerk. Tu Quoque.
You can only protest if it's a Black Lives Matter protest. What about a protest for increasing your immunity? What about a protest for educating people to the techniques and the strategies for increasing your immune system? They're out there, and there's no discussion about this amongst health professionals. Excuse me, amongst politicians.
Yep, whataboutism falls under this fallacy. Basically answering criticism with criticism.
What we saw yesterday, where they're breaking into Amazon Go in Seattle. Like, that guy owns the Washington Post. He owns the most left-wing newspaper in America. And you're like, not good enough.
Okay, this is a bit of a stretch, but that is kind of an example of the genetic fallacy, because Rogan is judging Amazon based on the CEO, Jeff Bezos, who is left-leaning and owns a left-leaning newspaper. So yeah, the genetic fallacy is judging something good or bad on the basis of where it comes from or from whom it comes. A better example might be not believing something from a certain news network because they've lied in the past. I mean, I'm not a big fan of CNN, but that doesn't mean that they never tell the truth. If I dismissed everything from CNN, that could easily lead to the genetic fallacy. The next clip is about the killing of George Floyd.
I don't know a single human being who watched that tape and didn't think, okay, that guy deserves to go to jail. Chauvin, right? The officer in that case, in the George Floyd case.
Who didn't think that? Yeah.
Everyone I know.
Everybody thought
every
that.
single person was like, yeah, that's real bad. Like cops. Like I know tons of cops. I'm friendly with tons of cops. And not one of them was like, yeah, that's good police procedure. I'm glad he did that. Like no one thought that.
This is not quite a fallacy, but it's almost a no true Scotsman fallacy, which is making what could be called an appeal to purity as a way to dismiss relevant criticisms or flaws of an argument. If Shapiro found out that yes, actually, there were people out there who thought that Chauvin should not go to jail, I'm predicting he would say, well, no decent human being would want to see Chauvin not in jail. Later in the show, when they're talking about Colin Kaepernick kneeling during the national anthem, here's a more clear-cut case of the no true Scotsman fallacy.
No, because I think that he made a serious error, which is that the most positive movements in American social history have been ones that don't kneel for the flag, but say, in the name of the flag, you should do X.
In other words, no true patriotic American would protest that way. Since the Colin Kaepernick controversy and the George Floyd killing, there has been increased discussion about defunding the police. Ben Shapiro's going to take that a step further, though.
Let's have a conversation instead about, like, just completely defunding the police. We want to have, like, a responsible conversation about things that make sense. We'll talk about, like, what if we just got rid of the police?
How crazy is that discussion? That discussion, when people were really saying defund the police, I'm like, cooler heads will prevail.
This is an example of the slippery slope fallacy, which assumes that if we allow A to happen, then Z will consequently happen too, therefore A should not happen. When they say that defunding the police will lead to no police, that is a slippery slope. Okay, here's another 2-for-1.
You're seeing what's happening right now in Chicago. You're seeing what's happening right now in New York, where you have this massive uptick in violent crime because it's perceived that the police presence has been diminished greatly. I mean, New York City has had record crime, record homicides.
Who would have thought?
Who would have thought?
First of all, that's an example of a false cause fallacy, assuming that a real or perceived relationship between things means that one is the cause of the other. They are assuming that the record crime, side note, I'm not sure exactly what they mean by record crime, but anyway, they are assuming that that was caused by defunding the police, which was not done anyway most places. Okay, let's rewind it and watch it again here.
I mean, New York City has had record crime, record homicides.
Who would have thought?
Who would have thought?
That's also an appeal to fear fallacy, when a person attempts to create support for an idea by attempting to increase fear towards an alternative. As I said before, there's no evidence to back up what they're claiming, and so they're really just trying to scare people, saying, hey, if we're going to defund the police, then there will be chaos, man.
That if you were protesting against lockdown, you were very bad, right? Then you were a racist and you were going to get people killed and you should wear a mask. And I was like, well, if you're I sort of agree with the mask thing. Like, yeah,
yes.
Okay. And then you get millions of people in the streets yelling at each other and breathing on each other and spitting on each other. And you got health professionals on TV being like, well, racism is a public health threat. I guess that you can do that now. It's like, well, what the?
You know, apples and oranges are both fruits, but other than that, they don't have a whole lot in common. So yeah, this is the apples and oranges fallacy, the false equivalence fallacy, making it seem that two different things appear to be logically equivalent when in fact they are not, even if they share a common trait. He's talking about the George Floyd protests, and he's talking about the anti-mask protests. They both are protests, but the anti-mask protests, hardly anybody was wearing a mask. So that's a pretty big difference. Here's another one.
A cultural change that does not place tremendous emphasis for black or white or for anybody on personal responsibility and personal agency. There needs to be a mindset change. We do this, by the way, in all other areas of American life, except for the most important decisions. In the area of sports, nobody does this routine. This is a point Shelby Steele makes. In the area of sports, if a kid does not have a good jump shot, nobody says to him, you know what, you don't have a good jump shot because your father didn't have a good jump shot, his grandfather didn't have a good jump shot, and the game is biased against you. We say, okay, if you want to be on the team, You're going to have to learn to shoot a jump shot.
Again, two things that you probably shouldn't be comparing.
I know people who died in the hospital of COVID and their family could not visit them.
Yes.
Like they literally died alone in the hospital of COVID and family could not visit them. And you're telling me that it's deeply important that we have like dance lines. This was stuff happening at rallies, like dance lines in the streets in New York to fight racism. That's deeply important, but a daughter being able to visit her dad before he dies, that's not important.
Similar to the appeal to fear fallacy, this is actually an appeal to pity, which is trying to make someone believe or do something only because we pity them or something associated with them. By Shapiro bringing up his friends who couldn't see their family, this is really unfortunate, but it doesn't mean his argument is true. Okay, here's the part of the show where Rogan and Shapiro just make a bunch of hasty generalizations.
So the economy collapsing at the same time as the George Floyd protests led people to start looting. And then people that didn't give a about George Floyd or Black Lives Matter were just stealing. And then the police was letting them steal. They were standing down in Beverly Hills and Santa Monica, literally cops standing there while people were smashing doors.
I gotta say, the media coverage of this stuff is just awful. The media were cheering this stuff on. I mean, they were simultaneously making two arguments that conflict with each other. One was, these are mostly peaceful protests. First of all, mostly peaceful is the most, it's the most loosely defined, arbitrarily applied term in history.
The irony here is that Shapiro and Rogan just got done giving 7 hasty generalizations, and now Shapiro is criticizing a hasty generalization. A lack of awareness there.
Well, if you get
O.J. Simpson was mostly peaceful that night. O.J. Simpson was mostly peaceful that night. For like an hour 15, he was really not peaceful, but for the other hours between sunset and sunrise, he was unbelievably peaceful.
The hasty generalization fallacy is when you generalize about something based upon a small or poor sample. This is actually apparently the most common logical fallacy. I mean, I do it all the time. You watching right now, you do it all the time. Most human beings generalize out of practicality. It's a good way to survive. But a hasty generalization is made when people just pick too small of a sample or not a representative sample. And yeah, in general, people generalize too much. I know our brains like to generalize. Crap, I just generalized. But no, I have evidence to back it up, I promise.
The media refuse to make that distinction, and then they act like the cops are the bad guys when they come in to arrest people who are violating the law. You're seeing this in Portland right now. They're trying to burn down the damn courthouse.
Yeah.
And the feds come in and start arresting people, and people are like, this is the Gestapo. It's like, okay.
Everybody's worried about everything being racist. Every single thing that anyone does. Syrup is racist. Pancakes are racist.
All right, the next logical fallacy is personal incredulity, although these aren't perfect examples of it.
I've never heard this term before, where a protest turns into a vast riot, wrecking all of Melrose, and everybody's like, well, it was mostly peaceful.
Because I don't exactly understand why they're attacking the courthouse. I don't exactly understand why they're smashing the windows at Amazon Go.
It's Steve Martin, right? They must hate these paint cans, right? Like from the Jerk, right?
But it went from this to literally tear down the structure of society.
The personal incredulity fallacy is saying that because one finds something difficult to understand, that it's therefore not true. Now, Shapiro might just be disingenuous here, but with Rogan, I think he really doesn't understand, and he probably should just learn more, maybe?
But isn't there always something like that? There's always like extremes on each position, and the truth lies somewhere in the middle.
That's the middle ground fallacy, saying that a compromise or middle point between two extremes is the truth. At this point in the podcast, they are now talking about the seemingly endless cycle of gang violence.
The answer is there's only one way to break that chain.
What way is that?
That way is to not pick up a gun and shoot somebody.
I think that's a simplistic way of looking at it if you're on the outside of that community.
It's also an example of the begging the question fallacy.
With the incredible influence of all the people around him, and that's all you see.
Good job, Joe. You're trying to correct them.
But the problem is the only way that's going to be the thing that your kid doesn't know is for you not to do it. At some point, personal agency has to come in.
It does,
because
education and teaching them about personal agency.
Also known as the assuming the answer fallacy, the begging the question fallacy is a circular argument in which the conclusion is included in the premise. When Shapiro argues that all you got to do to stop the cycle of violence is not be violent, he's kind of just brushing over all the reasons why this violence might be really happening.
If your father was in and out of jail, everyone around you is like that. If there's literally no influence that's positive in your life, The idea of saying to a kid like that, hey, don't pick up a gun and shoot somebody, that's way too simplistic a version of their future, in my
Well, I mean,
my
the problem is I don't see an alternative solution.
Oof, there's another one. That's the argument from ignorance fallacy, which assumes something is true because it has not yet been proven false, or something is false because it has not yet been proven true, which is what Shapiro just did.
But
People mix this stuff up pretty regularly.
Well, people are silly.
People are indeed silly.
People tattoo their eyeballs, Ben.
That is an example of a bandwagon fallacy, which is appealing to popularity or the fact that many people do something as an attempted form of validation. Here's another one.
People out there that have had some really good times with those bad ideas, Ben Shapiro.
And it may be that when I die, I look back and that is one of my great regrets.
It's pretty clear here that Rogan's joking, so I'll let these slide. Okay, jumping back to when they were talking about Colin Kaepernick.
If you just look at the gesture itself, isn't taking a knee even more respectful than standing with your hand over your heart?
I mean, then I imagine millions of us would routinely take a knee for the American flag.
You might also say this is the bandwagon fallacy because why does there have to be millions of people kneeling during the national anthem for it to be respectful?
Colin Kaepernick is a terrible spokesperson for this movement.
I'll give props to Shapiro and Rogan because they didn't do this one very much, but that is an example of the ad hominem fallacy, which is attacking your opponent's character or personal traits in order to undermine their argument. Sure, Colin Kaepernick may be a bad spokesperson. That doesn't mean his argument is wrong.
After you get benched for Blaine Gabbert and take millions of bucks from a major corporation, terrible QB rating is all you really need to know. Not a good quarterback is the answer.
Really? It's sort of a traditional thing where we're arguing over.
Well, I mean, it isn't the way that it was originally expressed.
Yep, that was an appeal to tradition fallacy, which is when someone encourages us to believe something is good because it is associated with things of the past. Related to the appeal to tradition fallacy is the appeal to nature fallacy, which is saying that because something is, quote, natural, it is therefore good.
Hey, look, this plant looks delicious.
I don't know, Grunk. That plant looks really strange.
What are you talking about? It comes from nature. Of course it's safe.
You kidding? Nature's already tried to kill you 3 times this morning.
So the odds are pretty low it would happen again.
You're doing it wrong. If you want to fight police brutality, say America is not living up to her promises. I know that over time my fellow Americans are going to come to realize that they need to live in accordance with the fundamental principles that founded the country. Mm-hmm. That's unifying. To say that the American flag is inherently non-unifying is really bad.
That's possibly a fallacy, also known as the argument from fallacy. It's assuming that because a claim has been poorly argued or a fallacy has been made, that it is necessarily wrong. Just because Kaepernick maybe went about it the wrong way doesn't mean that what he was trying to argue is wrong. After it was revealed to Shapiro that perhaps he got it a bit wrong about the reasoning why Kaepernick was kneeling, now we're going to see the special pleading fallacy.
The second take after talking to the military, yeah, that's better.
Military, rather, yeah.
Although he recently released a video that sort of goes back to the original explanation, suggesting that America is endemically and systemically racist.
The special pleading fallacy is moving the goalpost to create exceptions when a claim is shown to be false. And after seeing the evidence, Shapiro's earlier claims were wrong about the intentions of Kaepernick, and so he had to kind of sneak that in. Oh, well, he's still bad by this other thing. Okay, holy crap, this video turned out to be way too long. I guess I'm just gonna wrap this up now. I know I was a bit nitpicky and perhaps I even got some of these wrong, but I just wanted to show you how 2 smart, entertaining people can be guilty of a lot of logical fallacies in just an hour and a half of conversation. I counted 58 of them. For the record, I still enjoy the episode. And I am definitely guilty of using logical fallacies myself. One of my goals lately has been to stop using logical fallacies when making arguments. So maybe you can join me in this quest to be logical. It's very boring. It's a very boring movement, the logic movement, but... A special shout out to my friend Paul from The Felt Show for once again providing his wonderful puppets to make my video better. Be sure to subscribe to his channel, The Felt Show. I'll put the link in the description, or it's right there in the corner. I want to invite you to an upcoming virtual event. I'm going to be hosting a seminar Yeah, baby, seminar, how exciting, about logical fallacies. Basically what this video is about. And I'm gonna give you some tips on how to spot them more easily. We're gonna spend part of the time interactively. We're gonna see if you can spot logical fallacies in real life situations. So join me. All the details are in the link and in the description of this video. Limited spots are available, so sign up quickly if you want to join us. Oh, at the end of it, there will be an opportunity for a Q&A, so that's always fun.
So join me.
That seminar and this video were inspired originally by this book here. I've been reading this book since I first started teaching many years ago. It has lots of great scenarios and lots of good tips, and it's a great workbook for teachers. I've also put a link to buy it in the description of this video. So what do you think? How did I do spotting logical fallacies? Was I too hard on Joe and Ben? Let me know in those comments below. Thanks for watching.